Hello, this is John Faithful Hamer on the Likeville podcast. Today I'm going to be talking with Daniel Weinstock. He's a philosopher, professor in the McGill Law School. He has a lot of interest in what it means to be a public intellectual. We talk about politics. We end up talking about veganism, all sorts of things. So I had a very good time talking with him, and I'm sure you'll have a good time listening to it. Please be sure to like and comment on the podcast on iTunes. Thank you. Bye. Welcome to the Likeville podcast. This is John Faithful Hamer, and today I'll be talking with Professor Daniel Weinstock, who's a philosopher who teaches in the McGill Law School. Welcome, Daniel.
Happy to be here.
I'm glad you're happy to be here because it's not a very happy time in the world to be a liberal. It's when I first met you, we were at the end of history, and liberal democracies were on the rise everywhere. Now, yesterday, Putin was reelected, in quotation marks, and we've got Trump in the States, and we've got it's happening. So, what is going on? Why do you think there's been this turnaround away from pluralism, away from liberalism, away from towards much more authoritarian systems of government, and much more kind of a resurgence of ethnic nationalism? And what's going on?
Well, I shy away from the one-shot sort of big explanations, right? I think that there are a lot of things that have converged to create this moment in history. One of them has been talked about a lot, and I think it is part of the truth. I think it would be wrong to ignore it, which is the idea that there's a kind of a congeries of financial and industrial globalization that has left a lot of people in the lurch. There's also kind of a global discourse, of the urban elites who have more in common with one another than they do with people in their own nation states, and I think that this is something that I certainly experience. I'm traveling the day after tomorrow to Amsterdam, and I'll be sitting in a cafe which will probably look just like the cafe down the street here, looking at sort of hipsters reading more or less the same books and magazines as I am,
wearing the same clothes,
with whom I could probably join in a conversation without missing a beat. Whereas 100 kilometers out of the city, I probably have a hard time communicating effectively with people who are experiencing other things. So I think that that's part of the story. I've been thinking a lot these days, though, about some more micro kind of stories. I'm a big believer in unintended consequences. Basically, the best laid plans and all of that. Things just go awry.
Tragic view of history, yeah.
And sometimes things go awry because of things that people tried to do that were actually kind of good things. And, there's the oops, I wish I'd seen that coming kind of moment. I've been thinking a lot lately about political parties and about the role that political parties have played in keeping liberal democracies aloft by performing a fairly, I'm just going to say it, kind of an elitist role. They're political, and when I say elitist, I don't mean elitist in the sense of only the educated or something like that, but I think that there was a time in our history, I wouldn't want to date it with precision, where political parties were basically run by insiders, people who were party activists, people who were party operatives, and they made the decisions about how the political parties would comport themselves in government. They would choose their leader. Right? Mm-hmm. The idea that a party membership could choose a leader against the will of the party, right, is something that even only 20 years ago probably wouldn't make sense. We were both old enough to remember the way that leaders used to get picked, right? Delegates in who were fairly insiderish as well. You'd actually have to go to a place in order to vote for somebody who would then go represent you in a smoke-filled auditorium or something, where there would be actual on the floor and backroom horse trading and dealing. Somebody would walk over to the other side of the hall in order to pledge the support of their delegates to another person. I think the last time we saw that in Canadian politics was probably.
But 9 times out of 10, this had a very moderating influence because it was a big tent approach.
That's right,
and they were looking for somebody that would be so extremists of any kind were marginalized.
Exactly. And it might sometimes give rise to surprises. I think the last time we saw this in Canadian politics was with the election of Stéphane Dion to the leadership of the Liberal Party, where, in order to avoid Michael Ignatieff getting in, I think it was can't remember, Bob Ray or somebody walked over to Stéphane Dion, who I think had started polling fifth or something amongst the hopefuls. But the basic idea is that people who vote for the leader have a stake in the party actually performing well. They have been through a lot of discussions with people who are roughly like-minded, although a Big Tent party is one that encompasses a lot. At some point, and the internet was obviously one of the ways in which this changed, party membership became something that, first of all, you sold, right? When you were an aspirant to either a riding association or the leadership, you had to sell 10, 20,000 memberships, right? Almost as your entry card into the race.
Wow.
And party memberships become nothing more than a kind of a like on Facebook. Right, it's $10 to join the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. I have friends in Ontario who are NDPers who joined the Progressive Conservatives in order to. Well, I have known some who voted for Ms. Elliott in order to have a reasonable person there in case the Conservatives won.
I know people like that too.
I know people who voted for Doug Ford, thinking, well, if we vote for Doug Ford, we'll make the Conservatives unelectable. But the idea that you could put down $10 on your PayPal and join a political party and get to participate in the most momentous decision that political party has to make, which is who will be the leader, has turned political parties from something which was of the form that I described into an engine for populism, quite frankly, right? Where somebody could appeal to the electorate above the party sort of apparatus, heap contempt on the party apparatus, as Trump did with the Republicans, and basically get hundreds of thousands upon millions of people to vote for them. So I think that we have not appreciated the bulwark that political parties represent in keeping this liberal democratic thing aloft and keeping it from shading into the kind of populism that we're seeing today.
Yeah. Now, that's interesting because there's, I think it's Michael Holt, the political scientist. He has this argue the collapse of politics in the 1850s, and he says that the American Civil War, he doesn't take it quite this far, but he says the American Civil War probably could have been prevented. They could have gotten rid of slavery peacefully. That what happened was the big political parties, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, they were parties that ran in the North and the South. And so this had a moderating effect on both parties. They would marginalize anti-slavery activists on the one side and fire eaters on the other side. And that this, kept the peace. But when you had the breakdown of the big political parties, the Whigs, then you had the emergence of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party was able to elect Abraham Lincoln without even running anybody in the South.
Right.
And so imagine if I try and imagine these scary what if scenarios. Imagine if Harper didn't try to learn French and speak French, and didn't attempt to sort of run people in Quebec and show Quebec, hey, I'm actually going to come and I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you in French. Imagine if Trudeau did not immediately reach out to Alberta and say, I know you didn't vote for me, but I'm going to be your prime minister and I'm going to try really hard to defend your interest. I'm your prime minister too.
Right.
Imagine if you had, in either of those scenarios, you could have a very powerful separatist movement immediately, overnight, and that's exactly what he says. This is what happened in the United States in the 1850s with the election of Abraham Lincoln. The South realized they can put somebody in control of the federal power without even paying attention to us.
Well, that's right.
This is happening all over the place
now.
now.
And it's a
winner takes all politics. Right?
It's a very fine thing, and there are details of the way in which our political system is organized that keep that hanging by a thread that people sometimes don't attend to. I mean, Harper, you're right. Harper, the desire to produce a kind of a national story, a national picture, not a sort of, the hell with Quebec picture, but a picture where Quebec could be encompassed, was something that probably moderated him to some degree, brought him towards the center, both in terms of his politics and his sort of regional politics as well. But one of the things that we do in Canada, and, I haven't done the math, but it'd be interesting to look at this, we give a lot of weight to non-urban ridings. You and I live in ridings that are probably underrepresented by a factor of about 2.5 to 1 relative to rural ridings. And that's a feature rather than a bug in a sense in our system, according to some, because as Canada urbanizes as rapidly as it does, we don't want regions, we don't want outlying areas to fall into a vicious spiral of losing representation as they lose population share. And so we overrepresent them. We have ridings in northern Quebec, in northern Ontario, all over the place that are much less populous by a pretty considerable factor, much less populous than our urban ridings in Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver. Now, this is part of the story as well. The story that we're telling here, I think it'd be crazy not to recognize it. A city versus non-city kind of phenomenon. There is a growing cultural gap, I think, all over the world. If you look at the electoral maps that brought in Harper in the last couple of elections, the electoral map that brought in Trump, certainly in Europe. If you look at the way the big cities are voting and the way that the non-cities are voting, the suburban and rural areas, we're really getting two political cultures. Now, we have to attend to that, right? We have to attend to that as we, for reasons, and again, this is the unintended consequence thing. This is, oops, I wish I'd seen this when I did this thing for these other good reasons. To the extent that non-city ridings are perhaps a little bit more prone to accepting a kind of a populist message, and to the extent that we give them the kind of representation that that they have in Canada right now, we may see somebody, a Doug Ford perhaps, making the calculation that, hey, I don't have to have a national story, right? I can actually, my people have crunched the numbers, and we can actually get a working parliamentary majority of ridings just by, catering to ridings that have been overrepresented for reasons, again, which are entirely understandable and to some degree even laudable. So I think it really hangs by a thread. And the point that I made at the very beginning of our conversation, which is that very often these things are not meta-narrative things. They're like little institutional details that we don't really attend to and that we really don't notice, that either serve as a kind of a break to the floodwaters or that don't. The floodwaters are the thing that we look at, but the things that either keeps the floodwaters from, drowning us or not, are often just little structural features of our political systems that we sometimes don't attend to enough.
Okay, another question I wanted to ask, which ties into this a great deal, is that one thing, a debate that's happened in Plateau Montréal a great deal among like Québec Solidaire people, and right, there's a lot of the argument is that you shouldn't necessarily see all of this ethnic nationalism and this as being uniformly a right-wing phenomenon. They say that, in fact, in order to get a certain critical mass of support for the welfare state and for traditionally left-wing, you have to have a feeling that there's a community. You have to the more diverse a political community becomes, the more multicultural it is. People don't feel necessarily all the time like they don't see themselves in their neighbor. And so in a place that like Finland, that is very, very ethnically homogeneous, there it's no surprise that you have huge amount of support for a generous welfare state and also for a criminal justice system that is not overly punitive and great. Whereas in places like the United States, where you have a much more diverse population, where the urban people don't see themselves in rural people and vice versa, where you have racial divisions and things like that, that surprise, surprise, you have support for really harsh criminal justice system, and then also for not very much support for a social welfare state. So there are people here and elsewhere who say, if you actually want to achieve left-wing goals, have a more kind of socialist society, you should actually be okay with assimilation, and you should be okay with maybe tightening up borders a little bit more. What do you say? Because that seems to me like two things that are very close to your heart.
Yeah. That
could potentially be at cross purposes.
Pull apart, yeah. So I'll say two things. The first thing I'd say is that, the numbers are actually... So Will Kimlicka and Keith Banting, Will Kimlicka, who's obviously highly invested, he's, a Canadian political philosopher who has written probably the most influentially about multiculturalism and about how, a liberal Democrat almost by definition, should be a multiculturalist. He and Keith Banting, who's a real number-crunching political scientist at Queen's, have actually been doing international work trying to see if that equation holds good, right? The more cohesive, the more ethnically homogenous a society is, the more support there is for the welfare state. And unsurprisingly, the numbers are... They don't tell the opposite story, but they don't tell that story quite as cleanly and univocally as one might have thought. But the other thing I'd say, and this is where, I looking at the way in which the numbers get crunched is far beyond my my expertise. But the one thing I would say is that the worry that I would say that community is not what you might call an independent variable. In other words, communities don't just happen. They get created or they get destroyed, often by deliberate political discourse. So, the story of the Canadian welfare state is one, that was that got into place when we already had quite a bit of immigration. My parents came to Jews from Eastern Europe came to this country from Eastern Europe, and the story there was that within a generation, the immigrant would hit the national mean, right? I can't remember growing up. Obviously, there was the French-English thing in Canada, but the immigration story was largely a happy story. So I think that
But they had a different model. I mean, but that you take, like, for instance, the guy who coined the word organic, like we think of organic foods, was J.I. Rodale. He started Prevention Magazine and Organic Farming and Gardening. He came over, and he was originally Jerome Cohen, and he changed his name to make it sound more English.
Sure.
Jerome Rodale. And this was so the common thing for people coming from elsewhere was to not only learn the predominant language. So you move to Quebec, you learn French. You move to the States, you learn English, but also to try as much as possible to fly the flag and
Right.
be a member of the team. And so I think the argument that I hear very, very often here in the plateau is people say, why don't we go back to that? That worked much better than this whole, we want you to stay, exactly the way you are and don't assimilate. And
So I think that there's a tendency to exaggerate the degree to which we actually have moved away from that model. I think immigrants, by and large, recognize, realize, and appreciate that coming to a new country means all those things, right? I mean, if you look at the success of Bill 101 in creating fairly homogenous linguistic community, walk just out the door of this building, and you'll see kids from all over the world speaking French with a Quebecois accent, right? Mm-hmm. My kids played hockey for years. Hockey, one of the great national nation building institutions, and I met more people from a greater range of ethnocultural backgrounds by being a hockey dad, probably, than being an academic, quite frankly. And so, the thing that's happening is that we, and when I say we here, I mean the sort of majority, the media that represent the majority, have trained their radar elsewhere. In other words, they rather than focusing on the 90% of people's experiences, which are experiences of integration into the main institutions, political institutions, cultural institutions, sporting institutions, they have focused their attention on the 10%. Now, those numbers mean nothing. I just made those up for the sake of the exercise. Through which they've been saying, well, we also want to maintain some of our cultural distinctiveness as well. So I think that the story may not be as different from the 1950s to today as we think it is. I mean, when I was very, very involved in the charter debates over the Charter of Values and the Bouchard-Taylor,
I wanted to get to that. Yeah,
the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, our melodrama here in Quebec for going on.
Can you just briefly recount what that drama was? Because I definitely want to talk about that.
I think my chronology of it starts with a Supreme Court decision called Multani, which was a Supreme Court decision based here in Canada, where a young Sikh boy came to school had been coming to school forever, really, wearing a kirpan, which is a small ritual dagger that many Sikh men wear. Never been noticed because it was under his clothing. I think he'd been playing in the schoolyard and it fell out. And one of the school teachers, in ways that I can totally understand, said, hey, you can't come to school with a knife. so it's a long and interesting story, but the case ultimately made it up to the Supreme Court of Canada, who in a 9-0 decision said, well, look, we have seen Sikh boys wearing kirpans all over the country. There's never been an incident. If there were a real security concern, it would have come up at some point. There doesn't seem to be. Kids are coming into schools with baseball bats and hockey sticks with which they can do themselves any manner of harm if they choose to. So it was a 9-0 decision of the Supreme Court of Canada saying that the accommodation that had been reached by the school after this incident, which was that the boy could keep on coming to school with his kirpan on condition that he wore it very tightly sheathed underneath his clothing, was fine. So this was met with a collective shrug of the shoulders in the rest of Canada, not because English Canadians are more virtuous, I think, but just because there's a larger Sikh community, especially in Ontario, where, there's a significant Sikh community. And in Quebec, it led in some of the media to a Canadian multiculturalism has become an insane ideology, which we here in Quebec have to rid ourselves of. And I think that was really the starting point. It was fueled largely by one media conglomerate, which owns a couple of one of the big newspapers here and one of the big television stations. And they went essentially on a feeding frenzy, looking for every possible case of some immigrant getting some benefit, completely confused because very often these were these had nothing to do with public institutions, but rather private actors coming to agreements with one another. Remember the famous why should I go into the YMCA?
Yeah. Yes, you should.
Yeah,
that's such a sexy example.
There was a case. I guess now it's becoming ancient history.
People still talk about it.
12 years ago, where some yeshiva bookers, some young Orthodox Jewish boys studying Torah in a yeshiva in my land, were just across the street from the YMCA, where people were exercising before.
Scantily clad women.
Well, or men, whatever, quite sweating and in tight and diminutive clothing. And this was not necessarily compatible with the thinking of biblical thoughts. So the yeshiva went to see the YMCA and said, look, keep on keeping on, but we'd like to pay for we will pay for frosted windows so that our boys aren't distracted by your people doing their exercise.
Your hotness,
and the YMCA, this is a cash-strapped institution, not a public institution, but a cash-strapped institution. Thought new windows, free.
Great.
Bring it on. And I guess the idea was that the windows let in the sun without, they blocked the sight of the people doing their exercise without. It was a one-way sort of thing. So it wasn't taking away from the people exercising on the inside, except for the people, I guess, who wanted to be seen by the people on the outside. So this became a bit of a firestorm, where again this was seen as a case of accommodation, whereas people like myself had to sort of scream ourselves silly, reminding people that these are two private actors coming to a private accommodation. If you have pink flamingos on your front lawn next to my house and I don't like the sight of them, if you and I agree that you're going to reduce the number of flamingos that are there by half, just as a compromise, that's two.
Yeah, and I don't know anybody that goes to that particular temple, but I do know people that that go to that gym.
Yeah,
and they said uniformly, look, we're not comfortable with the fact that people are checking us out while we're working out, so it's a win-win on both ends. Like nobody was saying,
but everything was fueled by the desire to exaggerate the problem. So about we just celebrated actually the 10th year of the publication of the report. The provincial government of Quebec, so 12 years ago, named a commission that was headed by two of our leading intellectuals, Charles Taylor and Gérard Bouchard, to study the problem. Its report was handed down just over 10 years ago now. And one of the first things that it did was go send investigative teams out to all the places that had been the sources of these stories, and found out that most of the time they were either misreported, crucial elements were left out, they had nothing to do with public institutions, and so should be irrelevant from the point of view of people worrying about too much legal and accommodation. But we have been in this melodrama now for going on 15 years. And so the point that I wanted to make is that because of this, I think that and I think that it's gone beyond the media now. Maybe this is something that has afflicted all of us because we live in a world that is so informed by the media. We tend to see difference a lot more than we see the remarkable integration of immigrants into the labor force, into social institutions, into public institutions, running for office at a rate which is what you would hope to see people. They're not sort of separating themselves from the public institutions, from political institutions, from political parties, what have you. And so I think that it is still the case that integration in Quebec and in Canada in general is a good news story. We've just focused our attention somewhere else. We have started to focus a lot more on the difference. Look, when I was growing up, the story, I grew up in the 60s and early, 70s. I turned, I became an adult in 1981. So, my childhood and adolescence is the 60s and 70s. I lived in an almost exclusively Jewish neighborhood, right? Talk about, non-integration. I lived amongst Jews. My parents weren't even religious Jews. They were actually quite unreligious Jews, but that's just what you did. You congregated with your own. My father would go to work every day, and he'd work with Italians and French Canadians, and I'd go to school where I was surrounded by kids from all sorts of walks of life. But there was a form of self-imposed residential segregation. To some degree, there still is. We didn't have cameras and, reporters coming in saying, look, the Jews are living by themselves, off in their, ghettos here. What was focused on was the other side of the story, which was quite remarkable, again, integration into the political institutions of Quebec. A little bit of anti-Semitism, no worse than anywhere else, I would say. So it's a long-winded way of saying that, I think that we should be careful before we assume to too great a degree that the story has changed all that much. Now, this goes back to the point that we started with like a few minutes ago, which has to do with the welfare state and diversity. I think you're right. I think people do. I think it has to be the case that not just for the purposes of redistribution, for the purposes of all sorts of things. It is better when people view themselves as part of a community rather than part of just an anomic, set of institutions. There's a worldwide movement now, which is actually very, very interesting, called compassionate communities, which basically says, look, from the point of view of health, right? There are all kinds of things that we can do in order to recommunitize, or if that's a word, our communities. They're actually good for people's health. If you know that there's an old lady over there, who's living by herself, have a kind of an organized rota in the community where people will go knock on her door every couple of days and see if she's okay and if she needs anything. And if it gets icy, make sure that she can get her groceries and stuff like that. If somebody's recently lost a partner, having some kind of a community. There are all sorts of things that we can do as communities to make our communities more community-like. They're actually good for our health, our mental health, even our physical health. But I don't think that the making of community requires ethnocultural identity. I think that it requires leadership signals that point to our commonalities and don't obsessively point to our differences for political gain. So going back to the the thing I said at the very, very beginning of this exchange, community is a dependent variable rather than an independent variable. It depends on what other people are doing, and in particular, it depends on what political leaders and media are doing. And one of the things that is probably the most troubling in the last few years in Quebec and perhaps even in other parts of the world is the degree to which political leaders have sought to accentuate the differences, point to them, view them as problematic for political gain out of a political calculation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that you see this with natural disasters. You saw this when there was that heat wave in France a little while ago where they asked all these medical professionals to come back early from their vacation, and the vast majority of them refused to do so, and a lot of old people died, right? And then you can see what happened in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina. And when I think about one of the moments that really defines for me what it means to be like a Quebecer, what it means, I think about the Great Ice Storm, right, of 1998. And I remember we had lost all power, and it's the middle of the winter. and the temperature was supposed to go down quite a bit that night, and there was no electricity, and most of the heat is baseboard electric, and so they were worried that there would be people like old people and people with disabilities who would be too cold, or they wouldn't be able to get out, they wouldn't have their medication or food. And so they said, we're going to actually go house to house and knock on every single door and ask people if they need blankets, if they need food, if they need, anything like that, right? So they went on the radio and they said, we need a lot of volunteers. The military was organizing it, and they said, if you'd like to volunteer, please go to the closest high school to you and in the gymnasiums, and we're going to... and so my friends and I heard this, and we immediately went to the gymnasium. The gymnasium was packed within a half an hour. And I'll never forget, like, the soldier who was at the door, there were tears streaming down his face. Like, he was so moved by how quickly people wanted to come forward and to volunteer for this. Right? So it seems like community of that kind where people will, this is, part of why we both disapproved of Andrew Potter's, infamous piece, right, where he talked about, what's wrong with Quebec society. And so there is this kind of sense of community here, but I often suspect, I'm worried that it does have something to do with the fact that there's more of a feeling of homogeneity among a lot. I worry. What do you think about that?
Well, I think again that the evidence that you look at, we're I don't know when this is going to air, and hopefully this situation gets a happy resolution. There's a little boy who's missing right now in Cartierville, Hunsik, who's been missing for 8 days. I think that the community response, or hundreds or thousands of people who have who in the community, which is a very, very multi-ethnic community, that have joined in the efforts to try to find him, combing square centimeter by square centimeter the area around his home. I think that people are of mixed motives. People are complex. That's what makes politics what makes life interesting and sometimes frustrating. And politicians and media and all of those things that mobilize us can either appeal to the better angel of our natures or to the worse. And both those things are mobilizable. What I see is a calculus, obviously a calculus that maybe goes back to some of the things that we were talking about before, about the extent to which you can actually have political success by playing wedge politics. The calculus has shifted in a way that has made some politicians feel, and not just in Quebec, in the rest of Canada as well, like there may be some advantage to be had from playing to the worse angel of our natures. And I think that we people like us should keep on sort of arguing about, look, that's what's happening. It's not that people are inherently racist. It's that they are being mobilized. But
there's risks associated with that. I mean, I remember you, unlike a lot of sort of ivory tower intellectuals, you got down into the mess of the whole charter debate, and you took public positions on it. And there was a whole kind of campaign of character defamation against you. They were going after you hard. So there's a lot of risks associated. Well,
there's
with
risks. There's individual risks, because to some degree, there's I think that's the case in anybody who takes political stands, be it as a public intellectual or as an actual politician. Look, we have friends, both of us, I think, who have recently, to perhaps their own surprise, and I don't know if this is the time that we want to jump into this, achieved some political success at the municipal level here in Montreal. by waking up one morning and they, what, I'm mayor of what? Whereas a few weeks before that didn't seem like it was going to happen. I know some people who are now over things like whether a road should be allowed to go over the mountain. Are getting hate email on a daily basis. I think that it is something that well, I can't deny it, and it is something that is psychically and emotionally somewhat exhausting, right? I woke up one morning just before I was supposed to give a fairly public speech to a group called Québec Inclusif around the time of the charter debate, to find that I had like 1,000 emails in my inbox from places around the world calling me names.
Yeah.
Had no idea why. And one of my friends pointed me to an article in the Huffington Post in which, it's a long story, but a lecture that I'd given at Berkeley, which was recorded, had been quite cunningly sort of chopped up to make it sound like I was
maliciously cut up. They made it sound you were representing another person's argument.
That's right.
You were presenting another person's argument, which is common to do. You steal
in the first
and you
person.
Recount. Yeah. And they made it sound as
like
if you were saying,
position.
Yeah.
So it's something that I'm a lot more careful about. This is something that we do in philosophy. When you entertain a position, you kind of go into the voice of the person who would hold that position.
Yeah, it's like, Hitler argued this, and this is what his theory of history was.
Here I am, Hitler, and to try to, and in a way, it's part of good pedagogy, right? To if you represent a position in the first person, you are almost psychologically led to representing it more fairly than you would by representing it in the third person. So I think it's a pedagogical tool that has its merits, but then has its dangers. So I woke up to find that I had been labeled in an editorial in the Huffington Post as a defender of female genital mutilation.
Yeah, you were on like some right-wing watch list or something.
And luckily, I know lawyers, right? Even before I joined the law school, I immediately contacted friends who, the matter was shut down within 24 hours. There was an apology and the article had been retracted. But I think of other people who don't necessarily have the luxury of my kind of position, who can't just call up a bunch of lawyers to have them send out, lawyers' letters saying cease and desist, or, you will have defamation suit on your rear end in minutes. There is a personal cost. On the other hand, I think very often the bark is worse than its bite. In this particular case, the person who had written the editorial emailed me subsequently, to try to patch things up, and it was clear that, I don't want to go into too much personality issues, but I don't always worry about the people who bark the loudest. Although you're right that it is extremely taxing on an individual psychological level. And, a lot of people who, again, without necessarily being ready for it, have found themselves in political office here in Montreal, having been not necessarily trained for this sort of thing, I think are finding it very difficult to deal with the hate mail. There's something about email, there's something about the ease of communication. You don't, writing a letter with a pen means that there's going to be a little bit of filtering and self-censoring. Sending off an email at 1 o'clock in the morning is the easiest thing in the world, and you can say anything you want. And
I think the other side is true as well. I think I always tell my students, and I tell my friends, if you really, if you voted for a politician or you like certain thing and they're doing what you wanted them to do, send them a long message, send them a thoughtful message saying, hey, I support what you're doing.
Yes.
This proposal about closing down that road from Mount Royal, this is what we voted for.
Right.
This fits into what you're doing, and send them. And I actually got a message back from our bear. She said, thank you so much. It's nice because it can be very hard emotionally when you're getting so much hate.
Yeah.
And it's nice for people to come out and, say some nice things about it, like you did, right, about that, right? To say some positive things about what's happening. Right?
And to remind people, I'm actually agnostic. I think on the face of it, it sounds like a good idea. As someone who used to own a car and used to do exactly what they say, namely use that road as a fast way of getting from west to east and east to west. I know that they were right. It sounds like a good idea, and the point of it is, we elected a party that made no bones about the fact that it wants to reduce the use of private cars in Montreal. Anybody who paid even a trifling attention to their campaign, you didn't have to go into detail to know that. And part of the way you're going to do that is to make it a pain in the butt to drive a car, to change the calculus. When I owned a car, I remember time and time again, the mental, and I knew what was happening as it was happening. There's the car right on the curb. It's a little bit too cold outside. It's a little bit too hot outside. I know that 5 minutes after I get into my car, I'll be thinking, why did I do this? Why did I get in the car? But it's that micro, it's that micro decision of the first instant. It'll be really cold walking over the expressway to the metro. It's going to be unpleasant, or when it's hot. I don't want to be sweaty. But if you just pushed it a little bit more, made it even a little bit less attractive for me to drive a car, that micro moment, that first moment, I would overcome. That's the way in which we make change. It's not this is actually a big issue about, why is it that, we know the science of climate change and we know the science of pollution, and yet people don't change their behavior. Well, part of it has to do with the immediate cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't affect our immediate cost-benefit analysis. And in order to get anywhere, it has to. So you just have to make it a little bit more painful. They told us that that's what they would do. And, I welcome a political party getting into power and actually, doing really robust things in order to get to where they think we should be as a city. Happy cities, by the way, when you look at the happiness indexes, happy cities it's almost a straight correlation with linear correlation with absence of cars in the city core.
Wow.
Once we get over the hump. Walking cities, cities with good public transport, are cities in which so the idea that people will desert the downtown core, no evidence for that at all. On the contrary, once the car logic is set in place, that's where you have a risk of the urban core becoming decayed. Because if people are thinking car as the parameter, as the default, well, they have a choice between suburban malls where there's ample free parking, or downtown where they're going to have to pay an arm and a leg to park if they can find a parking spot. Well, I'll go to the mall, right? But if you manage to change that default, right, then all of a sudden the city becomes a really attractive, fun place with a lot of walkable spaces, especially in the summer. So yeah, I don't know how we got to this actually, but
it fits perfectly with that. Because one of the things that's always impressed me about you is, like, not only as a philosopher that you try really hard to be a public intellectual and to engage in what's going on and get involved in political discussions and try and elevate the debate a little bit, but you also try to kind of live philosophy to a large. I remember, I'll never forget the first time I met you. It was at a dinner party, and I offered you a glass of wine. And you said no, thank you. And I said, why? And you said, well, I drove here tonight, and I think it's unethical to drink and drive.
Oh my, what?
And no, but you didn't say it in like a preachy, shitty way. It was like you just said, I think it's unethical to drink and drive. It increases the likelihood that you might have lower response time, and so I'm no thanks.
Right.
And you said also, and you kind of laughed, and you said, well, also it makes me a little sleepy, and I don't think I'm gonna sleep here tonight. So,
right.
and so then I offered your wife one. She's like, yeah, okay, fine. But one of the more recent things that I've seen as this in you is that you've recently decided to stop eating meat, which I was amazed.
Yeah,
can you? How's that going, and why did you make that decision?
Well, so not only meat, I'm trying to cut out pretty much all animal
you're going
products.
Straight vegan.
Well, I don't like that word. I'll explain why. So one of the things that I am the director at McGill of a thing called the Institute for Health and Social Policy. And one of the issues that I've become very aware of and actually kind of freaked out about, quite honestly, climate change we kind of know about. One of the things that I think has been getting less of the kind of media than climate change, and it really should, is antimicrobial resistance. Basically, the idea is that we abuse antibiotics. And by abusing antibiotics, we're creating superbugs that are going to be difficult to kill. Now, if you think about humanity before we invented antibiotics, it was not a pretty sight. And there are a lot of scientists now who are talking about a post-antibiotic world, which is pretty scary. Now, we have kids, and you think, oh, well, is it because I used antibiotics too much when my kid had earaches? And no, not at all. The proportion of the overuse of antibiotics that comes from individual use, is infinitesimal. The big part of it is in industrial animal husbandry, where, think about it. It doesn't take, PhD and whatever to understand it. You have animals living in close proximity to one another, to say the least, right, in caged conditions. And prophylactically, they are just fed antibiotics in order to keep them from getting sick from one another. Now the antibiotics that they use is then in the food, obviously, but it's also in a lot of the spill off, right? Scientists are taking measures from our drinking water and finding that we have high levels of antibiotic in our drinking water, in the water that we use for all kinds of purposes. And this is entirely to do with the way in which we use the industrialization of animal husbandry for meat, but also for dairy and for eggs. I think most of the vegans that I know are people who think that any case, off in the rural areas of France, whenever a farmer grabs a chicken and slashes its neck to have chicken, the sin has been. So I don't believe that, right? But I do think that it is a huge both a moral and a human catastrophe. Industrial animal husbandry is a big civilizational mistake. And so that's really the reason that I'm not 100% vegan, right? If I do go to the countryside, or if I'm assured that there's a piece of meat that, has not been through this, I have no moral objection to it. Although I find that as I stop eating meat, the desire to eat meat lessens. Right. So it's not like, I'm jonesing for that steak. I actually, on one occasion, so I have.
Did you go to Moish's?
I did. So I have three principles, which is, I won't eat any animal products except in three cases. One is if it would be culturally insensitive not to. So you're in some faraway place and you're invited to dinner, and
you're visiting in a new community and they want to eat the heart of a seal. You're going to be like, bring it on. Yeah.
Bring it on. Usually that won't be industrial. You won't be, The second is if there would be some kind of, really culturally significant thing that I would miss. So I was in Denmark recently, and there's a restaurant called Noma, which the chef is a visionary kind of, one of the most important and interesting chefs in the world. He had a pop-up in Copenhagen when I was there a few months ago, and I managed to get a ticket. And I thought, okay, whatever he gives me, I will eat. And there was a little bit of meat, not very much at all. And the third is when I feel like it. So there was an occasion recently where a friend of mine turning 50, I wanted to go to Moish's for his dinner. I thought, I'll have a steak, and it made me really, really sick.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was not on the moment. It looked really appetizing, but the next day was not good. And I realized I hadn't had that much meat in months. And so, the desire for meat, as you have experiences like that, just goes down. So it's actually not that difficult. We live in a city, as someone who travels a lot and who has his Happy Cow app on his phone to find out where the vegetarian and vegan food is in the city. We live in a city which is probably one of the easiest cities to be a vegan in, of any city that I've come across. There are fast food chains, vegan fast food chains, one right down the street from where we are right now. I can walk from where I live in NDG to 6 or 7 really good vegan restaurants, vegan places that sell vegan substitution products. So I haven't experienced it as too much of a sacrifice. And, if we think of climate change as something that requires that we change some of our behaviors, like with cars and things like that, then I think we ought to be just as worried as antimicrobial resistance. But it leads to the conclusion not that, if we all cut 90% of our animal products out of our diet, there wouldn't be the call for the kind of mass production of animal products that requires industrialization, and the problem would in effect be solved. So the reason that I don't call myself a vegan is because there's a lot of baggage that comes with that.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
But I also think that there are a lot of vegans who are kind of absolutists in the sense that every, chicken killed is a moral fault, and that's not the way that I came to it.
Yeah. It's interesting. The Israeli historian Yuval Harari, in his book Sapien, I believe it's in Sapien, he pointed out something which I had somehow managed to get all the way to my early 40s without knowing, which is that if you take all animals on Earth that are, let's say, sort of bigger than a hamster or like, like over a pound, right? And you just by weight, and we're talking including blue whales and, elephants and everything. If you go by weight of all those animals, 90% of the animals on planet Earth right now are either humans or our domesticated animals. So cows, chickens, pigs, our pet cats, dogs. There's more dogs right now on like domestic dogs. Like if you add up all the wild wolves and coyotes and everything else all together, it doesn't even come close to the number of domestic dogs that there are in the world right now.
Well, I made it all the way to 54 without knowing that. So,
yeah, it's really quite. It's one of those things that when I read it, I immediately called up some friends who know about this stuff, and I said, "Is this true? Because this sounds like total bullshit." And they said, "No," and they pointed me in the direction of, they said, "No, that's completely true. He's not making that 90%." So right now on planet Earth, the most common animal on planet Earth is the chicken,
sure,
right?
Yeah.
And they're all basically our slaves.
Yeah.
Right?
There's a vegan advocate, and I forget his name, but this is probably something that can be quickly Googled, who basically was one of the early vegan advocates, arguing for a completely meat-free, egg-free, dairy-free diet, and he came to the realization. I remember reading this about a year ago, so recently, that it just wasn't working. Although, the rate of veganism today is it's an order of magnitude greater than it was even a decade ago, but he thought that it could never become a mass movement. So he decided to reorient all of his activities on chicken and said that if we could get people away from eating industrially farmed chicken, then the amount of good that we'd be doing would justify not really sweating the beef and the pork and what have you. I mean, think about it. Something that I'm starting to try to do at McGill with only limited success now is if you take a big institution like McGill and you think about all of the boxed lunches or the crappy lunches that get served at meetings,
Sure.
at lunch meetings, just because you have to give people food, right? And they hardly notice what they're eating. Either you're going to get them something really good, which you don't have the money for necessarily, and at a mass level, it's hard to produce 100 lunch boxes for people. So you give them a lunchbox that has like bread with some protein in it, right? And very often it's going to be chicken, because chicken is, say, from a religious point of view, you don't have to worry about Muslims or Jews, worrying about pork, and you don't have to worry about people maybe with high blood pressure or something worrying about beef. So chicken is the go-to meat, right? It's the go-to protein that you just stick between two pieces of bread. Nobody notices what they're eating, right? It's just literally in order not to be hungry anymore. Now, if you were to eliminate that kind of excess chicken, as it were, it's not doing anybody any good. It's not providing anybody with any aesthetic or gustatory pleasure. It's literally filling the hole. And you replaced it with some other form of protein. The amount of, and you multiply that over, thousands upon thousands of institutions around the world. Switch the default. Think about driver's licenses where we, used to have to tick a box in order to signify that we were ready to give our organs in case we got into an accident, right?
Yeah.
We forget to do it, right? Switch the default, right? It is assumed that you're ready to give your organs if you're in an accident, unless you tick the box, in which case, no. Let's flip the default with this kind of like excess meat that nobody's noticing, that's not giving humans any real utility relative to what they would have with a good, veggie patty or something like that. And just that, forget about veganism of an absolutist kind, just that would have huge amounts of an impact without anybody really, without any real significant cost for people. We always have to tick a box when we say we have special dietary requirements, right?
Yeah.
If somebody feels like they want the meat, right? Well, tick the box, and we'll provide it.
Yeah, it's funny. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, he talks about vegetarianism, and he says, he's not a vegetarian or a vegan, but he said he decided at a certain point to he's Greek Orthodox, from Lebanon, and he decided to just start keeping all the Greek Orthodox holidays. And he said, if you just keep the Greek Orthodox holidays, you're eating vegetarian about, I can't remember the number. It's something outrageous, like 150 days out of the year
Oh, is that right?
You're eating basically vegan or vegetarian. And he said just by doing that, he was able to improve his health. And he said if you look at a lot of these kind of older traditions, they had built right into there a lot of sensible ideas, right? And he said,
Sure.
So we end up eating like way too much meat.
Oh yeah,
because it is kind of as you say, it's the default.
Yeah, and there's a lot of just excess cruelty there, and also just a public health nightmare. Which, again, just wrap your head around the idea of a post-antibiotic world. Wrap your head around the idea that we both have kids, and the magic of that banana smelling kind of thing that takes your kid who's howling from an earache and soothes them within a couple of hours. Imagine a world, or even worse, imagine a world in which that's no longer there. Think of antibiotics and how important they are to surgery and to dealing with really, really serious stuff. We're now using the kinds of antibiotics which were usually thought of as second or third line, right? As first line for a lot of infections. It's not something in the scary future. We're going through it right now, and for some reason, it hasn't penetrated public consciousness quite as much as climate change. Not that climate change has made a huge difference to our behavior, right? But when I talk to people about I stopped eating meat because of antimicrobial resistance, they often don't really know what it means,
glaze over,
or know what the connection is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why would you be worried about antimicrobial resistance when you're eating meat? Well, it's because the only way that we get to have, $1.99 a pound hamburger is by using antibiotics on an industrial level in order to create cheap meat.
Okay, well, I want to circle back to something we were talking about initially, because one of the arguments that was made very, very often in the 20th century, even in the 19th century, was that liberal democracy was provided a kind of a political culture that was very, would protect you, almost like antibodies would protect you against extremist ideas. And if you had mass public education, all these things would create a very robust political community that could resist extremes. If you look back to even in the 17th century, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, when they were justifying why they wanted to have public education paid for by the state, as it was then, they specifically said this will prevent us from being easily infected by religious enthusiasts, religious demagogues, leaders, and things like that. We'll have a harder time coming and firing us up because people will have a basic knowledge. Right now, this is a very, very common idea. I grew up with this idea, but there have been people recently, like Jason Brennan, for instance, in his book Against Democracy, and then more recently, I just mentioned Nassim Nicholas Taleb in his new book Skin in the Game. And Brennan says that, in fact, political parties fire us up much more than we need to get fired up. They highlight our differences and exaggerate them in ways. So rather than actually making us more immune to these kinds of extremes, they encourage them. And then a sort of a complementary point that Taleb makes in his new book is he says that, he has a whole section there where he talks about the power of intolerant minorities and how very often if you have an intolerant minority on any particular issue, and if they're very committed, they can find ways to game the system, even in a democracy. So you can have we see this to some extent in Israel right now, right, where you can have a minority can end up controlling things if they're well organized and well disciplined.
Yeah, and so there are a bunch of things in what you said, and if the political system gives them traction, right? So it's actually funny that you mentioned this. I'm just finished a paper and I'm working on another one on these topics right now. We just went through a kind of an aborted debate in this country on electoral reform.
Yeah.
Right now, a lot of people point.
You're
to the
reading my mind. That's exactly my next question
good.
to you.
A lot of people point to the fact, and they're not wrong to do so, that the system that we live in Canada, which is misleadingly referred to as first past the post, right? So has a lot of kind of weird impact of the first past the post is that it distorts preferences of the population, right? So if you're a Green Party, fan of the Green Party or even the NDP, you can see your political party have 10, 15% support distributed more or less evenly across the country, and that'll get you pretty much diddly when it comes to representation.
Sometimes even 20%.
Because you lose every riding. And if you lose every riding, well, even if you've lost by one vote in every riding, you still get nothing to show for it. The flip side of that is, we can have, and we have had in this country, parties that have had large parliamentary majorities with not even 40% of the popular vote. So there seems to be a problem from the point of view of representation there. So people go from there to thinking, well, we should have a system of proportional representation where representation in Parliament is granted as a strict linear function of your representation in amongst the preferences of the population, which sounds fair. It has two perverse consequences. One, I think they converge onto one. If you look at a country that has the most proportional system there is, which is Israel, where the qualification, so you can play with a system in order to counter its more radical implications by having a qualification threshold, saying you're not going to get any representation if you don't achieve 5% or 10% of the vote, right? If you raise it too high, then the question is, why call it a proportional representation system at all? In Israel, I think it's 2.5. And that means that little parties, when comes time for one of the bigger parties to form a governing coalition, they look around and they say, well, those three guys over there, right, who just got three people elected, if we get them and those two guys over there, we can actually form a coalition. So what that means is that proportional representation can actually get you disproportionate power, right? A lot, again, looking at Israel, a lot of the more radical policies with respect to the imposition of religious, the fact that you can't take, El Al doesn't fly on the Shabbat and the buses don't run on Shabbat, is due to the fact that, 3 or 4 guys, basically, and I use the word guys advisedly, have basically traded their small number of seats for a disproportionate amount of power. So I think that proportionality in terms of just numbers in Parliament can lead to a disproportionate amount of power. But the more fundamental thing, and going into these questions, I thought, well, of course, you'd have to be crazy not to be a fan of proportional representation. When I started thinking about it, I realized that there's a virtue to a system like ours, which is the following. So imagine you are an environmentalist, right? Very radical environmentalist. You can either decide to go it alone, be a one issue, my whole party platform is going to be about environmentalism, in which case you have the risk of basically being shut out of power entirely, getting 5 or 10% of the votes across the country and no representation. Or you can say, you know what? I'm going to join the Liberal Party or the NDP, or even maybe the Conservatives, I don't know, and try to inflect their policies, right? So that they represent a little bit more of what I'm about. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be pure. But you may actually have an impact, right, on what happens. But the other thing is you're going to have to consider the way in which your policy priority can compose and comport with the policy priorities of other people. I mean, I think that one of the huge challenges that we have in this country is how to transform what is essentially an oil economy into an economy based on more sustainable modes of energy without devastating an economy that has been, we can't pretend that Canada is something different from what it was. Let's pretend that we can reinvent Canada from scratch as something other than an oil economy. We have hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people whose livelihood depend upon the oil economy, and we have to think not so much about how to get there, but how to get from here to there, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that big tent parties do is, say, an NDP, right? If you're an environmentalist who says, I'm going to go and try to move the NDP in a greener direction, well, you're going to have to figure out a way of making that work with the union perhaps sector of the NDP that's going to say, well, hold on a second, how are the jobs? How are we going to keep the jobs? At the end of the day, I think that benefits everybody because it means that there's a kind of purity of political purity that gets expunged from the system, which I think is a good thing, and we learn to compromise. So I think political parties now. Do the political parties that we have now do this perfectly? Absolutely not. And one of the things I think we have to think about as we organize the fine grain of our political systems is how to make political parties more like this. But the parties that are generated by this imperfect kind of first past the post system that we have here have the potential, at least, which parties under proportional representation have less, of being places in which people with different priorities are forced into a common space where they have to compromise with one another and come up with a kind of a platform where all of these different priorities are made to fit into something more or less semi-coherent.
Well, you bring up two sort of dirty words right now, which is sort of compromise, right? And that's, as Margaret Atwood pointed out in an op-ed a little while ago, she said that, in times of extremes, moderates are always the ones that are most kind of demonized, right?
Yeah.
And compromise is very, very demonized, and doubt is demonized, right? And so I'm wondering, because I've seen many examples of this in the last few years, where people who think compromise is a good thing, and think that think that doubt is a good thing. I mean, one example that springs to mind immediately, we were talking about before, the whole Andrew Potter affair. Like, I thought his article was wrong. It was wrong in some, and I was, being a patriotic Quebecer, I was sort of like, it hurt my feelings a bit. I was like pissed off about it, but I thought his apology was so genuine, and I thought it was great. And I would love to see much more, public figures be able to stand up and change their mind and say, I thought it was like this, I was wrong, and be able to publicly acknowledge and change their mind, where increasingly we're creating this environment that rewards people who just take a very strident position and say, I'm totally consistent and never apologize, right? Sort of Trump, his attitude towards lots of things, right, is in many ways kind of a style, right, that you see across the political spectrum. I'm wondering, how does sort of philosophy survive in an environment that has said that all the things that make philosophy what philosophy is are suddenly taboo? Right?
No, I disagree. I think that philosophy thrives in an environment of doubt, right? Our first philosopher, is certainly in the West, was someone who basically went around saying, the only thing I know is that I know nothing, but I can show you that you know a lot less than you think you do, right? So no, I think the doubt and the constant questioning of one's own views, you sent me a text yesterday that sent fear through my, because you said you were reading articles of mine. I change my mind all the time on detail. I think that the general sort of thrust of my views has remained consistent, but there are issues on which I've changed my mind all the time. And how could you not, right? If you're unless you hide yourself off in a corner and don't talk to anybody, right? I spend my time talking to people who critique my views, and both formally in academic settings, but also informally in conversation. And unless you completely, you have to be pretty arrogant, right, to think that the only stance that you could possibly take with respect to those people is just defense. I'm starting from the assumption that I'm right, and I'm going to show you ways in which to make you wrong. So a little bit of shameless self promo. I last year, as a bit of a lark, two friends of mine at the University of Montreal in the law faculty and I put out a book where we asked 50 people to write 3 or 4 page essays on something that they could do that would improve justice, not in some kind of global, sort of abstract way, but with respect to some institution that they're a part of, or that they're very interested in. What would be a change that would increase justice? So it did quite well. It was quite popular. These bite-sized morsels of 3-4 pages, both by academics and by people outside of academia. So we decided to do a second volume where we're going to ask 50 different people about something where they've changed their mind. Tell us.
That is such a good idea.
Tell us an issue on which you've changed your mind, because I don't think you can be a thinking person and not change your mind. But you're right. You're right about one thing, which is that we have generated a political culture where there is a cost to changing your mind, and there shouldn't be. I mean, if you're the French word a girouette, if you're like weather vane, then that's one thing. But I think that people appreciate and respect the sight of someone whose main convictions remain the same, but who may change their mind about how they think those convictions actually, where those convictions take them with respect to this or that issue, or who are willing to compromise even if they haven't changed their mind. I'll give you an example. I was involved for a number of years on the issue of physician-assisted dying, medical assistance in dying, as we now call it here in Canada, MAID. And I actually spent 2 years with a group of other academics writing a report for the Royal Society of Canada in which we argued for the legalization under certain circumstances of medical assistance in dying. When the law that the Liberals, so the Supreme Court, invalidated the criminal restriction against medical assistance in dying, the law that the Liberals put in place was much more small c conservative with respect to the kinds of cases in which people should be allowed in Canada to ask for medical assistance in dying than where our arguments had taken us. A couple of my colleagues on the committee have been spending their time sort of sniping at the government, which I respect. But, having seen the passion and the good faith with which people on the other side hold the opposite view, right, including a lot of physicians, right, who are basically saying, you have to realize, right? It's one thing to hold this position as an abstract kind of philosophical proposition. It's another thing for us who've been trained as the zealous defenders of human life at all costs.
Taking the Hippocratic Oath and everything, yep.
To say, under certain circumstances, we're not going to expect you, essentially, to end people's lives with their consent and with their requests and all that under incredibly parlous medical conditions, but nonetheless. So I think that what we arrived at in Canada was a compromise. The thing about a compromise is it buys you goodwill, right? If people can look at a political agreement and say, you know what, not perfect by any stretch, but I feel that I was listened to. I feel that my concerns, especially when you're a minority looking at a majority that could have just rammed through, right? It had the numbers, a more radical phase. Well, the thing about minorities is in a democracy, they have a pesky habit of becoming majorities. And, if they didn't have the goodwill on the other side of people saying, you know what, we disagree, but we're going to reflect your position a little bit in the ultimate policy. Well, what prevents them from getting into power and saying, well, we're just going to wipe everything out that you did before? So I think in a democracy, compromise is something that I think it can be morally required. It also establishes the foundation for a kind of trust over time that makes politics less of a kind of a crazy swinging back and forth between extremes that you have in places where trust is low, and more of an ongoing conversation. Now, the big challenge is, of course, there are issues with respect to which you shouldn't compromise, right? And identifying what those are is a huge issue, right? We'd say, well, where people's rights are at play, we don't compromise. But that's a weasel way out because, of course, there are differences. A lot of the differences that we have politically are on how to interpret rights. I have stood for people's religious freedoms, right, for years and years. What is the content of religious freedom? Do the parents at Loyola High School have the right to educate their children as they see fit? Well, you could have legitimate differences between people as to what the content of that right is. As someone who's defended religious freedom, I actually happen to think that children are a special case. We should protect children to some degree, at least, against their parents' sometimes well-intentioned desire just to rub their views off completely on their kids. So to say, well, we'll compromise on everything except where rights are at play won't get you far because rights are contested. So
I just want to pause you on that for a second because there's a very important point that I wanted to get to, because what you were talking about in terms of compromise and trust, this is something that I'm very fascinated by. So I'll give you in a smaller way. I saw this not nearly as much of a big deal as the physician-assisted suicide issue that you were dealing with, but I was, the church that Annalise and I go to, I was elected to go as a delegate from our church to the national convention, the Lutheran Church of Canada. They have a big convention every year in Saskatoon, and the hot button issue, which for a couple of years threatened to actually cause a schism and divide the church in half. There had been a lot of acrimonious debate about the whole issue of gay marriage, sort of would the church allow ministers to sort of have these marriages and have them be kind of sanctioned by the religious. And so there were very, very strong people on saying absolutely not. And then there were people primarily from big urban areas and from Quebec and Ontario, frankly, that were very much in favor of this, right? And what I thought was really fascinating is the way we got to a compromise was, first of all, by prioritizing things and saying, look, what do we actually believe? What is really important to us in terms of like doctrine and values? Is this really a top priority thing? Is it second priority? Is it third? And actually, I think if we're honest with ourselves on both sides, both of us think that this is very important, but it's lower down on the priority list. It's like, if we had to list our top 10 things, it's probably lower down on the priority list. And once everybody publicly, and to do that requires a lot of trust, because there's always, it's like haggling, right? There's always a vested interest. Habermas talks about this wonderfully with discourse ethics. There's always a vested interest in sort of exaggerating how important something is to you to gain an advantage, and like I want my way, or else I'm leaving, right? Or else I'm separating, or else give me my way on this, or we're getting divorced. There's an advantage to taking an extreme position, but if you want to get to compromise, you have to first sort of dial that down, right? And once we had everybody at the convention able to at least prioritize and say this is not a sort of make or break, then we were able to come to a compromise whereby the Lutheran Church of Canada said, okay, you know what? If you can follow your conscience on this, so if your congregation is a congregation that really thinks that gay marriage, there's nothing wrong with it, then it's okay for you to sanction these same-sex unions in your church. That's fine. If your congregation, if the local culture is very uncomfortable with this and doesn't see that, then you don't have to sanction them. So they basically came up with a pluralist solution, and it was wonderful, right? And I've seen in so many other instances where you have extremists, and one of the ways in which I think extremists gain an advantage in any context is when they convince you that this is the number one, this is a make or break thing. And I'm wondering, just because I know you've written a lot about compromise, I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The first thing I think we have to, and it sounds like this is something that happened, is the thing about the state, the thing about political norms, is that in a way there's really very little choice but to have common norms, right? There's something about the rule of law that basically is, accommodation is not so much, different laws for different people as applying laws, perhaps with a little bit more, circumspectly in certain cases than in others. It has to do with the application rather than with the law itself. I think in general life, one of the things that we have to sanity almost requires that we distinguish the areas in which it's necessary to have common norms and the ones in which it's okay to have others. So if you have a community like Canada where you have the backstop, or Quebec, I guess, where you have the backstop of, at the end of the day, marriage from the point of view of the law is not something that happens in religious communities, although, the religious officiant is the person who hands you the document from the government of Quebec. It is at the end of the day the norms of the government of Quebec that hold sway. To the extent that is there as an egalitarian backstop for everybody, that religious communities can choose to officiate or not in different ways is something that, as long as there's diversity there. I mean, in my own Jewish community, we have the same thing, not so much with respect to gay marriage, but with respect to interfaith marriage, right?
Yeah.
When Elizabeth and I got married almost 30 years ago now, there wasn't a rabbi in Montreal that would marry a Jewish man to a non-Jewish woman who wasn't planning to convert.
Wow.
And it's not the case anymore. There are rabbis now who realize that a Jewish household is not necessarily one in which both people have got the sort of well, to some degree, even as a question of prudence, as a question of survival, right? If the Jewish community, which is a very small community, shuts out people who want to be a part of it, but who don't accept that a condition for it is that the woman necessarily has to be Jewish, that's going to be shutting out a lot of potential members. There is now a diversity of views about this issue, and I think it's healthy for the Jewish community. The thing about the logic of, we've all been in this, probably even in our personal lives. There's something about the logic of debate and discussion where sometimes it can take you to, you'll take a stand where you didn't even think going in that it was that big a deal, and when you look back upon it, you say, why did I make such a big deal of this? There are ways in which conversations can go well, and there are ways in which conversations can go awry precisely in that way. All of a sudden, people will find themselves painting red lines around issues that going in weren't of particular importance to them, and going out, they'll think, well, I don't know why we made such a big deal of that. There are other cases in which it can go well, right? Social life and personal life would be impossible if there weren't instances of this as well, where people will accept to do the sort of core and periphery thing that you describe, right? These are my core beliefs, and I'm not going to move on these, but I have to recognize that these other issues are ones with respect to which they clearly are not absolutely central.
Well,
to my.
It's funny. We just to use a very interpersonal example.
Yeah.
Annalise and I, very early on in our marriage, we came up with this technique. I mean, we forgot about it at a certain point and we paid for it, but we've figured it out again. Is we came up with this technique where it was like a 1 to 10 kind of ratio. So if we had a conflict over something, like let's say you want to see this movie and I want to see this movie, right? We would say
a 2 or something.
We would say like, well, look, tell me like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you want to see this movie? And then I would say, well, I want to see it, but it's not like, it's really a 4,
right.
And she said, well, I really have been looking forward to this. For me, this one's like an 8. And so then we would go see the movie she wanted to see, and vice versa. If I said, I really want to do this tonight, I want to go to this restaurant, and she said, well, I really don't feel like it. And I said, well, it's like a 7 for me. How much do you want to stay home? Like a 5, right?
Well, the important thing there is not to abuse it, though, right?
Well, exactly.
Everything can be
the whole thing works. It only works if there's trust that the person is not going to exaggerate how important this thing is to them. And in all negotiations, it seems to me that this is very, very important. And there's always when faith breaks down between people, is I think part of what breaks it down, and I think the internet has very much ramped this up. There's a vested interest in a lot of these debates at being kind of a sleazy haggler, like I'll give you a quarter for it, right? Or hey, my initial price is not at all what I actually really want,
right?
And that ends up distorting everything. So if you're a single issue activist and you're pushing for one thing and you demand purity, it seems to me like in this environment, for a number of reasons, that actually is encouraged.
Yeah, right? I think trust is really an important concept, and it's understudied. There's a group of the research group that I'm a part of right now that is actually this is actually goes into the mental health issue even. So indulge me. I'm gonna move away from what we're talking about. But I'll get back to it. So there's an interesting piece of data that has been replicated, that has been verified across the world, culturally invariant it seems, which is that certain kinds of mental health issues, in particular psychosis, this is what are called in the technical language dissociative psychosis. So things like schizophrenia, where you literally disassociate from yourself, as opposed to say something like depression or anxiety, is much more common in cities than in non-cities.
Oh, wow.
And this is the weird thing. But again, it has been verified and re-verified by epidemiologists for 80 years now. The bigger the city, the greater the risk of some form of something like schizophrenia. So you're about twice as, the way that we put it when we want to dramatize this, you're about twice as likely to develop psychosis, to develop something like schizophrenia in London, England, than you are in London, Ontario, right? So if you plot it, it's like a linear graph. Now, that's weird, right? Because
I've never heard that before.
So there's a hypothesis that is out there called the social defeat hypothesis, which basically says, one of the things that cities do is they put you in contact with a lot of anonymous strangers, right? Who will sometimes, people talk about microaggressions, who will sometimes look at you askance, make a little clucking noise when you pass if you're a little bit different, right? Unsurprisingly, immigrants are more susceptible to this than are members of the majority population. And so the idea is that this actually exercises a kind of a psychic pressure, like that has a physical correlate on people's minds, and that at a certain point they just disassociate. So schizophrenia is kind of like almost like throwing up a separate self, right? It's disassociating from yourself as a response to the repeated experience of that kind of pressure, which is, ultimately kind of like almost a physical pressure on your brain. Now, what that doesn't explain is why it is that big cities, right? After all, in any given day, you're only going to come into contact with a finite number of people, right? Why is it that a city that is twice the size of another one will have twice the likelihood of generating psychosis? So the hypothesis that we're working with is that so you have to make the assumption that people have a vague sense of the size of the city that they're in, right?
Yeah.
The sense that you are part of a large community, and that B, the default is that everybody in that community, the default is that they are arrayed against you in somehow, that they are negatively disposed towards the realization of your interests in some way, is the thing that has this so the mistrust, that you harbor towards others, that may have been triggered by particular experiences, right, with finite numbers of people, but that then gets translated into, oh my God, there are 10 million people out there who are kind of arrayed against me, is what affects people's actually brains. So there's a hormone which is referred to in the literature as the trust hormone called oxytocin.
Oh yeah.
And it has been proved that basically traumatic experience of this kind can deplete oxytocin, and that there's a. So where am I going with this? Basically, the idea is, do people feel like they are part of a community in which there is trust, in which they can feel that the default is different, that the default is that anonymous others are not necessarily enemies, or not necessarily people that are out to get them, or not necessarily people who, if given the chance, are going to take an advantage from them? I mean, this is key to a lot of things. It's key, obviously, to people's health, right? To people's mental health, to people's abilities to function within their communities. But it's also key politically, right? And I think that one of the things that political leaders should realize to a greater degree perhaps than they do is that creating the sense, right, that we are all in this together, creating the sense that these anonymous others are not potential enemies, but that they are potential friends, or that at least the very least that they are not negatively disposed towards you, is something that is changeable by policy and politics, and even by rhetoric, right? And it's a kind of capital that a society can draw on. Fukuyama talked about high trust and low trust societies. I think there's something very important there. It is part of our ability to have conversations that have the form that you described, where we converge towards one another around shared concerns, looking for ways in which to perhaps downplay the things that separate us, as opposed to the reverse. I think that it's an absolutely key feature of the success of societies that we be able to generate trust, that we be able to maintain a high level of trust, not deplete it too much, draw on it when we need to, but know how to regenerate it. And I think leadership is about that, and not succumbing to the siren song of drawing on that fund of trust or depleting that fund of trust for political advantage, but realizing just how the interest of the community as a whole depends upon being a shepherd of that trust, of preserving it as the precious good that it is, for me, would almost be like if I had to give a one-sentence definition of political leadership, that's what it would be, is, promoting and finding opportunities to generate trust within the community.
Well, unfortunately, this is a human universal. It's been around for a long time, but a very big way to sort of generate enthusiasm for a political cause, and you can see this in identity politics, you can see this in all different kinds of politics, is you create this victim narrative.
Right.
And you just completely, again and again, talk about how they are all against us, they can't stand us, and you create this feeling of this beleaguered sense. And of course, being growing up here in Quebec, we've heard this a great deal. You hear it from certain people on the sovereigntist side saying, "Oh, we are constantly under attack from English Canada," and then you hear it also within the Anglophone community.
Oh my God!
This annoying, constant like, "Oh, they're coming for us in our beds," kind of thing. And so we've grown up with competing victim narratives, and you've probably grown up with another one, the Jewish one, which I didn't even grow up with. But so these, and you can see how kind of addictive and how insidious victim narratives can be. But what I'm seeing right now in the last decade, last sort of decade and a half, is competing victim narratives on a scale that I've never seen before in my life. I mean, the identity politics, the way this works, whether it be on the right, the left, everybody is selling a vision of no trust, right? Yeah. It's us against them. Yeah. We need to unite. We need to be well organized. We can't trust anybody else. Yeah. How do we get out of that?
I don't know. Because it's the thing is it's a very, very difficult. It's a very difficult question. It's difficult because some of it is actually emancipatory, right? So you think about
this is your colleague Jacob Levy's point, right? Where he actually
that's right. He has
nice things to say about identity politics.
Absolutely,
which is amazing.
So think about one of the most remarkable transformations of the last decade or so has been it's not nowhere near perfect, but it has been the ability. Put it this way: our kids are living in terms of their gender identities in a world which is unrecognizable from the world in which we grew up.
Absolutely.
Right? So, the idea that you may actually have a gender that is different from the one that seems to be you seem to be predisposed to by your physical appearance, by your sex. Something that grew up in the 60s or 70s, it was like a mental illness, right? A trans person was a mentally ill person, right? Who had to hide off, right? We know, probably as well. Families whose kids have said, from now on, I want to be treated as a boy or as a girl, and have had the environment, the schools, the families, the environment of friends. Adapt and accommodate that rather than sort of beating it back, or even worse, being so unaccepting of that that the idea of expressing it openly wouldn't have even occurred to these people. So, we may be our kids may be the first generation in the world whose gender identities are actually expressing themselves in the absence of or of the significant kinds of restraints and constraints that there were before. Now, the fact and I think that's like a human victory of huge proportions, right? That people no longer feel trapped in their bodies, that people be able to express themselves through the gender identities in the way that feels most natural to them, I think is something that is a human victory. That it has been repressed for so long, I think explains perhaps some of the more extreme manifestations of it, right? Think about the Tuval affair, or think about a lot of the intensity with which those views get expressed. I think may just be reflected by the fact that it's a pressure cooker that all of a sudden the steam has been allowed to be released. So the question is, how do we separate out the victim narratives that I think at a certain point just have to be allowed to play themselves out because people have been victimized, and I think there's something wrong about saying, okay, we're recognizing now that for essentially all of history, this way of relating oneself to gender issues has been repressed. But please express it in a very nice and calm, and don't raise your voices, because I think is a big ask. On the other hand, you're talking about like Anglo. I remember in the summer reading an article in the Gazette by somebody who'd occupied. Important institutional, I can't remember his name and I can't remember exactly what the institutions were, but this was a pillar of the Anglo institution who literally wrote in an op-ed that there will be a day, not too distant future, where English will no longer be spoken on the island of Montreal. And, I'm thinking, you have to be either of very bad faith, right? Very bad faith.
I canceled my subscription to the Montreal Gazette after reading an editorial like that. I just like, this is a small town university, small town paper pretending to be.
But as well as I do that view is the tip of the iceberg. Maybe nobody would express it in quite, those terms. And there'll come a time where no more English is spoken on the island of Montreal. It's just around the corner, But there is a discourse of victimization. And yet, being an Anglo in Montreal kind of rocks.
Yeah,
really,
it's amazing. You actually have more rights than francophones, because you have the choice to send your kids to either French schools or English schools.
Sure. I mean,
you actually have more rights than
well, your kids, our kids, come out of the school system fluently bilingual.
Yeah.
And that's for free. You don't have to do anything. You just have to kick them out the door and send them to school, and that's what they get. What a huge life advantage that is. There's a thriving Anglo culture here. I was. And there's more and more. I was at there's an Anglo Montreal band called Plants and Animals that was playing just around the corner here last night. It's 10th anniversary of their album Park Avenue, and they're an Anglo band, no question. They sing in English. The guys were speaking French and English, but obviously more comfortable in English. And I would say, just by listening to the conversations around me, more or less half and half French English. Right? You can be an Anglo artist, and the French community will embrace you. I'm not sure about the reverse, actually, right? I'm not sure that all the Franco artists are getting the love from us, Anglos, that is the case. So, I mean, it's hard to be an Anglophone or to have part of one's identity be English, live in Montreal and say, we're being wiped out. And yet people do. So the question is, how do you, if the idea that everybody has their truth, right, would mean that you'd have to both look at the, trans sort of revolution that I talked about a minute ago and say, yeah, that's good, and then turn to the Anglo thing and say, well, you can't celebrate the one without celebrating the other. I think it's just being critical, basically, continuing to keep our critical wits about us in assessing the claims that are being made. But we're living in a time, I think the same is true also of certain forms of more uncompromising indigenous identities, right? We will have no truck with the settler institutions. In my course at McGill, Foundations of Law, one of the segments of the course opposes two incredibly powerful Indigenous scholars, John Burroughs, on the one hand, who's a professor of law at University of Victoria, spending the year here at McGill, and Taiyaki Alfred, also actually a professor at the University of Victoria in their Indigenous governance program. And, we read their two books where one of them says, look, we have, he doesn't put it in these terms, but to be an Indigenous person in Canada today and to sort of participate in the institutions of the Canadian state is sort of like, being a Jew and participating in the institutions of the, these are institutions that have tried to wipe us out. How could we possibly have any connection with them? And on the other hand, you have Burroughs saying, well, you have to be instrumental. There are times where you have to say no, and there are times where you have to be able to see that, for example, getting an Indigenous person named to the Canadian Supreme Court, if ever that day were to come, would be a huge win for the interests of Indigenous people. I get, right, the compromising view, going back to where we were talking about, is Burroughs, right? There's no absolutes. There's no a priori, right?
Yeah.
But I totally get why an Indigenous person in Canada today would be very attracted by Taiyaki Alfred's view. And you just have to let it express itself, and to a certain degree you have a situation there where there's just zero trust, and the trust has to get rebuilt. You can't just assume it into existence, right?
Yeah.
You can't just assume it into existence by saying, look, you're being unreasonable, you're screaming too loud, trust us. Let's compromise here. The generations probably have to have sort of sidled up to one another very warily and before you get a fund of trust that makes it the case that the Burroughs voice is going to be more sort of dominant in the discourse than the Alfred voice.
Yeah, this is something that comes up in my ethics classes, all the time, because it really, really bothers me. And maybe I should, lighten up on this quote, but it bothers me that I have students who come from, relatively privileged suburbs, and they'll go to South America or to Central America or to Africa for some sort of development program, and they go there for a weekend or a week, and they participate in building a well, and they take a nice big Facebook cover photo, and then they come back. And I think anytime I see manifestations of human goodwill, that's a beautiful thing. I'm glad to see people thinking altruistically, and that's great. Whether they're being nice to a dog or being nice to anything, I'm happy. However, it seems to me such a scandal that right now in Canada, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we have all of these Indian reservations where they don't have clean drinking water, they don't have proper waste disposal, and I think I tend to be sort of parochial when it comes to, I think you should take care of your family first before you take care of other people. You should take care of your neighborhood first before your city, right? And you should... Right, and so it's a scandal to me that Canada has communities that are living in these conditions right now. And I said, well, why don't you, write to your MP, it's to say you're really upset about what's happening in Northern Ontario right now.
To be sure, and it goes back a little bit. I just had a thought, and it escaped my mind.
Yeah.
I had a thought that just flew by on this
about the lack of trust and the two different. We should not participate with the Canadian system, or we should be instrumental and try the.
I was going to be making a connection with something else, but
like victim narratives and the phrase.
No. I think with going back to what you were saying about. The fact that we have in the wealthiest country in the world, we have communities where the life expectancy is 30 years less than it is for the rest of us. High rates of suicide, basically living conditions that we wouldn't accept for anybody in our community. One of the things that this isn't what I was going to say, but I'll say this anyway. One of the things that drives me to distraction. Yes. Now I remember the connection. One of the big problems with politics and with moving forward on things is making positive changes requires changes in people's lives. And it's one thing to we now live in a regime where this is starting to wear thin, I think, but for a couple of years it looked like he was going to be able to basically ride into the sunset and get like majority government on majority government, a prime minister of pure symbolism, right? Who will cry, when apologizing about whatever and show up at all the pride rallies, and we just saw the India trip, which was quite an embarrassment.
Yeah.
But when the rubber hits the road, and you have to make changes, so. If you really believe that the nature of the relationship between the settler state and indigenous communities has to change fundamentally, right? Well, that means that you accept that even if it hurts economically, even if you can't drill that pipeline, through indigenous land, well, that's what we're going to have to do. I wouldn't go to, Belgium and presume to, be able to drill a pipeline, without their consent through, Flanders or something like that. Well, maybe we should start thinking of the way in which we have despoiled the natural resources that we find on land that has been indigenous indigenous land in something like the same way, and yet we don't. So Trudeau has allowed us to have the best of all possible worlds. On the one hand, feel good about ourselves because we have a prime minister who cries at all the right moments and apologizes with what seems like real intensity, but he's not going to require that we change anything about our lives, right? He's not going to, agree to something with Indigenous people with respect to their sovereignty over their land that is going to make the gas at the pumps any more expensive. So,
it's funny because I heard a lot of the same things from my friends in the United States about Obama. They said, Obama gives beautiful, beautiful speeches, and he shows all the right emotions at all the right times, but he doesn't actually change anything.
It's interesting, if going back to John Burroughs, and so I was beginning to say, when I forgot what I was going to talk about, I was going to begin to make another point, and then I remembered my point about, we're not at the end of the day willing to live by our ideals to the point where it actually hurts a little. I was going to make another point, which is with my inability to stomach anymore a kind of Canadian self-congratulation. Yeah. Right. That, we're not the Americans, and, look at how much more clever we are than they are, and look at how much more sort of solidaristic our society is, than we don't have guns and stuff. Some of that is true, but one of the things that Burroughs, John Burroughs, the legal scholar that I was talking about a minute ago, shows in his book is with respect to Indigenous issues, even though there may not have been a politician, who has chosen to do the photo op thing in quite the same way that our Justin has. There are a range of issues where quietly, without it necessarily making a splash, Indigenous people in the States have it better with respect to their ability to, exploit economic, engage
natural
in
resources,
engage in economic activity, more sovereignty, than Indigenous folks in Canada are. So, it may be true that Obama was very good at the symbolism and not so good at the reality. But with respect to Indigenous issues, I think that even under Republican presidents, and a lot of this is state by state, obviously, but there's been much more under the radar, not necessarily trumpeted on the front pages, progress in the United States than there is in Canada.
It's like Elizabeth May says that the most environmentalist prime minister of all time was Brian Mulroney, and the most environmentalist president in the United States was Richard Nixon. This is just wacky,
Yeah. I mean, it's so important to look beneath the rhetoric.
There's I'll never forget this. It was the most vicious cartoon, I think, or one of the most vicious cartoons I've ever seen. I think it was Doonesbury, and it was in the late 80s when I was a teenager. And it was, you had imagine there's two houses. They're the big houses in the suburbs, and they've got a 4-car garage, and they're they're next door neighbors, and there's a traveling salesman who are selling political ideologies. Right. And one guy has a briefcase that says conservatism, and the other one has a briefcase that says liberalism. And so the conservative salesman says, you deserve everything you have because you're a good person and you work hard, right? And the salesman selling liberalism is giving his pitch, and the guy says to him, he says, look, I like your ideas. I don't want to give up all my stuff. I'm happy with my position in society. And the guy says, oh, you must be mistaken. You don't have to give up anything you have. Right. You can have everything your neighbor has. You just have to feel bad about it.
Right.
It's just it was so, I had it up on my wall when I was a kid.
And this goes back to, connecting some of our discussions. This goes back to, I talked about some of the virtues of the kinds of moderate politics that our political system tends to generate. Now, nothing is perfect. At the end of the day, as Isaiah Berlin taught us, no social world without loss, right? Every political system has a downside. I think the downside of ours is that moderation can sometimes take the form of just a cushy, complacent, status quo. And I think that in Canada, the ability to inject radical new ideas into the body politic is lessened by the fact that we do have a tendency for our politics at the end of the day to gravitate towards a kind of cushy mushy center. especially when, as you say, we tend to be generating politicians who let us have our cake and eat it, right? Justin Trudeau, I mean, we'll see. The latest polls suggest that something that was inconceivable only 6 months ago seems to be happening, which is that, he may be a one-term prime minister. Feel good about ourselves because he looks good on the world stage, right? And seems to be saying all the right things, and on that basis, reflecting well on us. For a while I was traveling for work, around Europe and the United States, the first word on everybody's lips was, "You guys are so lucky to have Justin."
Yeah,
I'd say, well,
I think that too. Yeah, all the time.
There's a little bit less there than meets the eye,
which is exactly what people were saying when Obama was in office. We would go there. We had Harper, and we were saying, "Oh, you're so lucky that you have Obama." And then progressives in the States were like, "Well, actually, he's drone bombing the hell out of Pakistan." And
in defense of slight defense of Obama, although you're right that the Obama record with respect to foreign policy, the Obama record with respect to even immigration, quite frankly, we've been justly bemoaning Trump's expulsions, but under Obama, it wasn't as if there wasn't ratcheting up of actual on the ground expulsions from the United States. In defense of, if you think about Obama and the American political system was built to achieve gridlock. Right, the founding fathers were terrified. They were terrified of what's happening right now. They're terrified that some man, would be a man of overweening ambition, would manage to turn the political system into a vehicle for his ambition and pride and ego. And so, the president, in a sense, doesn't have much power vested in that office, right? Requires the consent of Congress, and Congress doesn't have the institution of party discipline that we have, right? Yeah. So,
George W. Bush kind of tried to set it up.
He did. But think of Obama with healthcare, right?
Yeah.
The Obama plan that ended up getting implemented was way, way watered down from what he had hoped for. And part of the reason was because of the Blue Dog Democrats, or were they Blue Dog? Yeah. Who basically stood up to him you think, here's a guy whose party has the majority of both houses. He can ram anything through. Well, no, he can't. So, and that in the American system is a feature rather than a bug. For all of the terror that Trump is sort of generating when we read him, it may actually be something that has saved humanity, right? The fact that at the end of the day, for all of his blustering, he actually hasn't been able to do that much. In the case of the Canadian Prime Minister, some political scientist wrote that there is no more powerful position, in proportion, than a Canadian Prime Minister in a majority government, because you have.
It's like Sir Wilfrid Laurier said, in his departing remarks, he said, "Were I not a gentleman, I could be dictator."
That's right. You have no real you are the executive and the head of the legislature. You have party discipline, which means that you can impose, your will on your party. You can actually kick people out of the caucus if they don't vote the party line on issues that the party has decided are matters of party discipline. And so, the potential for somebody who has progressive rhetoric like Trudeau to actually implement an agenda, I think, is greater than in the case of an American president. And so to that degree, I think I'm looking at healthcare as the narrow case of, the one signature piece of legislation that Obama really wanted to leave power having achieved. Now, he did achieve something, but if you look at the original plan and look at what ended up going through Congress, it was milquetoast.
Mm-hmm.
Compared to what he had hoped for. And that just has to do with the nature of the system. It gives politicians perhaps a bit of an excuse. Look, I just couldn't do it because people within my own party were standing up to me. Is it a virtue? Is it a flaw? I've written a little bit about this, about the, one of the, positive things that you could say about party discipline is it takes that excuse away from a politician, right? If you vote for Projet Montréal, right, because you've actually read their platform and listened to their interviews and said, yeah, these guys are going to do something pretty radical to tame cars in Montreal. and they have the power to do it, and then 4 years later they haven't done anything. You don't want them to have the ability to say, well, we really did want to, but look at all these checks and balances that have been put in place that got in the way of our doing it, right? There's a clean there's something about there's a kind of clean moral relationship that this is what we're going to do. You're giving us the power to do it. And if we don't do it, we don't really have an excuse come the next election time to say, oh, well, the blue dog Democrats got in our way. Mm-hmm. Now, there are a lot of things about party discipline that are obviously, negative, but it is something which makes it the case that someone with progressive rhetoric like Trudeau has less of an excuse when the reckoning comes 4 years later to say, well, it was all rhetoric because really, the institutions were lined up in such a way that I couldn't do anything else.
Yeah. Well, Laurier said that whole line about, if were I not a gentleman, I could be dictator. One of the public scraps that you've picked, I remember, was with Harper, where an instance where he was not acting like a gentleman.
Right.
Can you sort of just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this was gosh, I can't even remember the year. So because there's so much power vested in the office of the Prime Minister in Canada, a lot of the restraint comes not from baked in, right, institutional checks and balances or from explicit rules, but from conventions, right? Yeah. There is an understanding amongst gentle men
people.
at the time, gentle people,
yeah.
That certain powers will be used in the public interest rather than for partisan reasons.
It's not codified. This is the way we do it.
It's not codified. This is the way we do it. So one of the things that the power that rests in the office of the Prime Minister is the ability to prorogue Parliament. Basically to say, we're not suspending Parliament. We are saying Parliament is now no longer sitting. We'll take a break. And this is different from the thing that you do when you dissolve Parliament before an election. The idea here is essentially the government has kind of come to the end of its legislative agenda. It's done the things it said it would do, the things it hasn't been able to do, probably won't be able to do, and it's time to reset, right? So you go away, you write a new throne speech, set a new legislative agenda, and then you call Parliament and you have a new speech from the throne or something. But the idea is that you do it when you have a good faith belief as Prime Minister, your cabinet has a good faith belief that really this is what Parliament needs in order to be able to move forward usefully between elections. Now, in his minority, when he had a minority government, Harper was facing the possibility of a no confidence motion before Parliament that would have been spearheaded by an unholy alliance of New Democrats under Jack Layton, Liberals under Stéphane Dion, and the support, though not the active alliance, the support of the Bloc Québécois under Gilles Duceppe. And at that point, not because there was any belief that it was needed, the government had actually just started its legislative agenda. Harper calculated that if he prorogued Parliament for a few weeks or months, that unholy coalition would come to a realization that it was unholy, would unravel, and he'd then be able to continue governing. And that's what he did. He actually did it twice in two slightly different sets of circumstances, and actually was right in the first case. The Liberal Party was there was an internal insurrection. Michael Ignatieff took over. The coalition fell apart, and there was no confidence vote. The idea was that, this is a dangerous precedent, that the power to prorogue is something that is actually, when you think about it, quite huge, right? You say for the next few weeks, Parliament, the House of the People, will no longer be sitting while we, the government, retool our legislative agenda. You really want to do that, A, with parsimoniously, and B, in a non-tactical, non-partisan way. So I wrote a letter, I remember he did it just before Christmas, I think, when he knew that people were starting to no longer pay attention. I remember sitting in my pajamas on the couch and saying, I'm really pissed off. So I wrote this thing saying, this isn't right, and it's not just right as a matter of ethics. It's also not right as a matter of constitutional law, given that so much of our Constitution is unwritten, is conventional. Sent it around to a couple of...
It was a real, j'accuse. It was it was great.
I sent it around to a couple of colleagues who both made some suggestions about changes, but then said, if you're going to send this out, do you mind if I added my name to it? Before long, it had hundreds of signatures on it from constitutional scholars and political scientists and philosophers from around the country. Actually got me onto what's his name, Solomon, Power and Politics.
Oh, right.
The thought that I would ever be interviewed on Power and Politics.
Yeah.
So somebody told me that this was quite a significant thing because Harper actually dispatched one of his ministers on the news to say, well, this isn't of any interest to Canadians who really are just interested at the end of the day with their pocketbooks. All these things about prorogation are just academics
just
and
them
journalists.
urban elites.
Just urban elites. I was told, look, don't worry about it. For him to have dispatched a minister to talk about this means that he actually was a little bit worried about it. But it goes back to a point that we were making at the very beginning, which is that, it's hard to get people excited about something as arcane as prorogation, right? It's it's not like... It doesn't resonate. It's not sexy, right?
No, it's not.
Is that a Polish, dumpling kind of thing? People, and yet, and this goes back in a way, so much of our ability to withstand, tyranny is a strong word, but the abuse of authority, the abuse of power, such as that, or to withstand, the winds of populism depend not so much on our ability to make the right philosophical arguments, right, but on our institutions working in the right way, and sometimes at these little pressure points that nobody really notices until they give way. I think it's a really interesting case of that, right? That, here is this convention that we didn't notice until now because, by and large, everybody was sort of sticking by it. You don't notice something until it breaks. And it's a terrible precedent for prime ministers to use that power in a partisan, tactical way.
Yeah, it's funny. You and Martha Nussbaum both started off in philosophy departments, and yet you ended up in law schools.
Yeah.
Right now, a generation ago, this would have been seen as very, very bizarre.
Yeah.
But it's become more and more the norm. Top law schools are hiring philosophers and putting. What is going on there? What explains the sea change?
So law is, and I think that especially a faculty like McGill that does view itself not just as a training ground for future lawyers, but as an academic, place for the deep academic study of the law. Every single one of my colleagues has a very significant research agenda going on. Law is really, in a way, applied philosophy. There isn't. Let's put it this way. When I was in a philosophy department, I was in a great philosophy department at the University of Montreal, 25 colleagues who were all just absolutely expert in their field. There were a lot of people that I respected their work, admired what they did. Very difficult for me to have a conversation with them because I just didn't know anything about what they were doing, right? The logician, the really formal logic guy had more conversations with his colleagues in math or computer science
than
I could have with them. A lot of historians who are really down in the weeds of the archives, doing work that is probably closer to what somebody would be doing in a history department.
It's history of philosophy more than philosophy. Yeah.
Whereas in law, the person doing criminal law is thinking about, responsibility, is thinking about punishment, is thinking about things like, think about the notion of the burden of proof. Think about the idea of beyond a reasonable doubt. That is some...
It's heady. It's at least as intense as the free will problem.
You don't have to dig to find philosophy, right? It's right there on the surface, right? Think about taxation. I taught a seminar on taxation with one of the leading tax legal scholars in Canada, Alison Christians, because what is taxation? It's about how to achieve distributive justice, right? It's about what tools to use in order to redistribute the fruits of social cooperation in a just way and without generating too many perverse consequences. So do we tax, what do we tax? Do we tax consumption? Do we tax income? Do we tax capital, as Thomas Piketty would have us do? How do we balance those things out? Again, that's philosophy. Constitutional law is really just political philosophy, made into an actual working instrument. So property. I mean, we could go on and on and
Yeah,
on.
no, I agree with you 100%. I'm just curious why the law schools figured this out.
Well, I think that, I mean, there's a human, all too human reason, and then there's a substantive reason. The substantive reason, I think, is the one I've given, which is the realization that there's just a lot of philosophy in the law. I think there's also at a certain point a kind of as there are academic trends that make it the case that once one place does it, it becomes costly and it works out, right?
Yeah.
It becomes something that people are attracted to. It becomes difficult for other places not to do it, right? So I think that there may also be something on the order of that going on. But Canada has University of Toronto, I think, probably was first off the mark in realizing that philosophy and law had a natural bond, and there are 2 or 3 colleagues there who have joint appointments. I think there's a little bit of both. I'm just months away from becoming the president of the Canadian Philosophical Association.
Oh wow!
And,
congratulations.
Yeah. One of the things, the thing that I've made central to my year as president is trying to both make philosophers, but also other institutions within the academy, outside the academy, of the virtues of training in philosophy as something that isn't just symbolically good or something that makes you feel good about yourself. But look, we live in a world where the expertise that is needed in the economy changes so quickly that it's almost pointless, right? To say, okay, we need 14 of people with that particular BA or MA.
Yeah.
Because once you've trained them, by the time they've finished their training, the train has moved, 5 stations down. It's almost triviality or banality to say, but I think philosophy is makes people philosophically or intellectually agile when it's well done, when it's well taught, in ways that I think the modern economy requires more and more of. So law schools may have been first to realize this, but you can't shake a stick around my university these days, around universities, without coming up against somebody worrying about AI, artificial intelligence, right?
Yes.
Programmable cars and whatnot.
Or an AI lawyers, right? That would have at their fingertips every precedent.
AI lawyers, AI diagnosticians in medicine. 5 years ago, right, this was something that we read in Wired, maybe, there were just a small number of people who were thinking about AI, and it was like, sci-fi movies, Ex Machina or something like that. And now we have, like sex robots and driverless cars, like around the corner, literally around the corner. So obviously there are philosophical issues there, we actually now have to think about how to program a car to make choices about what to do, including what to do with its driver if it comes up against a situation where it's the driver or 5 people out there who are going to get, so there it's
wild.
Like
Absolutely
all those
wild.
Crazy sci-fi cases that we taught our students about are coming to the fore. But again, it just shows how quickly things move, right?
Yeah.
And I think that a certain amount of intellectual agility is, if I were, a multi-billionaire running a big corporation like Google, or I'd want to, and probably they are, hire a lot of philosophers rather than engineers whose expertise is going to be, I'd want engineers too, but I think you want the big thinkers as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was mentioning to you before about Neil Ferguson's whole idea of the tower and the square, and that the conflict between networks and hierarchies, right? And how he says that right now our situation is very much analogous to the 16th century. That he says you would not have had Martin Luther without the printing press, and he says you would not have Trump without Facebook.
Right.
And he says so. What's happening right now is these networks are so extensive and powerful that they can take down hierarchies, which is what happened in this. And so I'm wondering, there's kind of a crisis of authority happening right now, and so the name of this podcast, Likeville, is to some extent based on that, right? So you had the internet, the people who created the internet, they were almost to a man, they were left-leaning liberals, urban liberals, and they thought, and they didn't just think, they said explicitly that they thought the internet was going to bring the world closer together, and it was going to bring the true gospel of liberal values to these benighted small towns. They had a sort of mythological small town, which I've dubbed Sameville, where everybody's sort of white and wrong. And they thought, we're going to actually bring the light of enlightenment to this place. But what they didn't anticipate, once we're talking about unintended consequences, right? What they didn't realize was that actually they created a new kind of virtual reality small town, this thing called Likeville, which is the evil twin of Sameville, or doppelganger, you might say. And that's that it now, these days, anybody who has a crazy conspiracy theory, has some sort of wacky idea, you can find an online community of people who believe what you believe. And it has an amplifying effect. So you become a member of this community, and they have all these prefab arguments and stats and factoids. Yeah. And so now what was just kind of a single issue whack job becomes a sort of a veritable Swiss Army knife of bullshit, right? Like they've got all this. They've been empowered, right? And we were talking about this before. I've seen people who are struggling with mental health problems, especially psychosis and anxiety. If you're feeling scared about things, you can find a group of people that'll make you way more scared, right? Whether you're afraid of vaccinations, whether you're afraid. So that seems to me that it makes the whole job, right? Because Neil Ferguson's point is that we have this idea that somehow the printing press just made it possible to spread lots of good ideas, which brought down the Catholic Church. But he says, actually the witch burning craze happened because of the printing press. The printing press created the witch burning craze as well as spread the Protestant. So he says bad ideas spread through networks just as rapidly as good ideas, right?
Yeah.
Which we're living through right now.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you think?
Well, I definitely, I definitely recognize the danger. I think somebody's going to have to do a really good, and maybe this is being done. There's work here for a historian to think precisely about these issues. How much of a watershed has the internet been in terms of has it changed the game completely in that respect? You're absolutely right that there was this utopian hope, right? That it would be that the internet could be an agora, a place where we could all meet virtually despite our great distances and differences, and
as equals.
Yeah. And Cass Sunstein has written just, I think 3 books now, Republic 2.0, on how we've gone from the idea of the agora to the echo chamber, where the algorithms are basically making it the case that we're just sort of, without even trying, right? We don't even have to go looking for them. They come to us, right? People who are like us come. I'm someone who still believes in the importance of things like newspapers and current events, the old style sort of places, like the op-ed pages of I think one of the great losses is the city newspaper, right? The newspaper, which isn't like a national newspaper like the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, but something that allows a community to speak to one another. And I think in the United States, I can't remember what the number is, but the number of city newspapers that have disappeared is it's just vertiginous, and the ones that have remained, if you look at Canada, the Montreal Gazette basically gets 80% of its content from sort of national. It's the same thing as the Ottawa Citizen, which is the same thing as the Calgary Herald. It's all basically coming from the same place.
Well, you could see that when the election, when they all came out for Harper, front page, and that was just so just so clearly showing which side of the bread there is buttered on, right?
So I think that's something that, the internet hasn't yet been able to replicate, this kind of thing where even if the paper has an editorial line, by and large, still you have different columnists, you have the left-wing columnist and the right-wing columnist, and people will everybody reads the same paper because there's only a couple of papers, right? Think about the pre-internet ages. If somebody wrote an inflammatory op-ed, people would be arguing about it around the coffee table not that long ago. Whereas now we don't read the same things, right? So how can we? I talked about algorithms. Things can get tweaked. I read something about a woman who had invented a fairly simple app that you can put on your phone that rather than connecting you with someone who's ideologically simpatico with you, will put you in just random sort of like Tinder for ideological opponents.
I heard about this on Sam Harris's podcast. He had Cass Sunstein on.
Yeah, sure.
And he mentioned that app. He said
yeah.
it specifically like puts you in touch with sort of viewpoints that you wouldn't be likely to find in your little sort of informational ecosystem.
That's right. So, I mean, that's obviously that's a very small scale thing. I mean, the thing that's frustrating is that the potential is there, right? I mean, just think of how much time we spend on the internet. Just think about how much stuff is out there. I mean, the amount of information. I remember my son once saying something when he was young. I don't know. We were wondering about whether some actor or actress had been in a movie or who the actor had been in such and such a movie. And he said, and I quote it, stuck with me all these years, "Dad, why do you ever wonder about anything? You have an iPhone." And he was right, of course, right? I have, the whole of human knowledge is there in my pocket. Now, the thing that's frustrating is, when talking about newspapers, I sound like some old. I am very much a kind of a technological determinist, by the way. I do believe that we have
medium is the message.
The media. We have to find a way of harnessing this technology rather than hoping for a day where it doesn't exist, or certainly going back. Right is just not going to happen. So how do we change, this huge potential in ways that, again, maybe realize not the enlightenment thing of enlightening the benighted masses, but creating a space where people can sort of come come into contact with different views. I'm not sure. But I think that's a huge challenge because we're going to be, going back to one of the things that I mentioned before, some people have been I talked about how cities are potentially toxic for people's mental health because of the vast multitudes that are out there that you don't know, but you're kind of aware of them, right? You're kind of aware of them looking at you. And and somebody's been writing, I can't remember the name of the scholar, it's gotten some legs. The idea that, in a sense, the internet has a kind of function in people's lives. It's almost like a city. It is a place where we live, right, increasingly, and where we are surrounded by, just multitudes of nameless, faceless strangers who we vaguely sort of know are kind of observing us and looking at us.
It's funny because when you were saying that, I immediately thought about, this is obviously years ago, but being in Amsterdam once, and I took these really powerful magic mushrooms, and I started to feel, one of the very common side effects of any kind of psychedelic, whether it be acid or mushrooms or even weed, if you smoke a lot of it, is a kind of paranoia,
hyper-awareness
right?
of
like paranoia.
Yeah.
And I remember very clearly walking around the city with Annalisa, and I felt like everybody was staring at me. And I felt like that kind of every look, it's almost like that, that Doors song, right? People are strange when you're a stranger. Faces look ugly when you're alone. So I had that kind of feeling. And I remember describing this to my cousin when I got back. And my cousin had struggled with schizophrenic. He was he lived with it for his whole life. He died recently. But anyway, I mentioned this to him, and he said, "That's what I feel like all the time. Right. Unless my medication's working really, really well," he goes, "I walk around, I feel like people are staring at me all the time, when in fact they're probably just making a funny face for no reason. It's not at me, but I feel that." And so it very much rings true to me what you're saying about how people who have a tendency for one reason or another to deal with psychosis, it would be much more intense in a city.
Yeah.
Anyway, do you have any sort of closing remarks?
I don't know, except to say it's a wonderful opportunity to have this kind of long form, sort of great to chat. And I hope that other people listening to this have as much fun listening to it as I had participating in it.
All right.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity, and it was a lot of fun.
All right, me too. Thank you very much for coming.
Pleasure.
Bye. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Likeville podcast. Please be sure to like our podcast on iTunes and leave any comments if you have any. And also, if you'd like to support this effort, please go to our Patreon account and contribute to Likeville. All right. Have a good day.